Chapter 10. A Mother Forged in Turbulent Times. Zhang Fenglan was born into a China that was constantly shifting under her feet. Her early life unfolded during the aftermath of war and the sweeping political changes that redefined what it meant to be Chinese. Like millions of others, she learned to survive through scarcity, silence, and grit. Food was rationed, opportunity was limited, and education was often interrupted by chaos. But these early years hardened her into someone who could endure anything, and that endurance would later pass directly into her youngest child, Jet Li. She wasn't a celebrity, a teacher, or a scholar. She was simply a mother trying to keep her family alive in Beijing during some of the harshest decades of the 20th century. Yet, within that simplicity lay quiet brilliance. She managed to feed, clothe, and raise 5 children after tragedy struck. The death of her husband when Jet Li was just 2 years old. Imagine that. A single mother in 1960s China, with no financial safety net, working herself to exhaustion every day to keep her family together. There were no government programs to help her. There was only persistence. Zhang Fenglan worked odd jobs, sometimes selling handmade goods, sometimes laboring quietly wherever she could find income. She sacrificed her health, her youth, and even her personal dreams for her children. Jet Li would later say that she was the strongest person I've ever known, not because she fought with her fists, but because she never once gave up. When you look at Jet Li's controlled precision on screen, the discipline, the stoicism, it's not just martial arts training. It's Zhang Fenglan's legacy. She turned pain into focus, and that focus became Jet Li's foundation. But her story wasn't cued just about hardship. It was also about the powerful emotional restraint she passed on. In a culture that rarely allowed open grief or complaint, Zhang Fenglan embodied quiet resilience. She taught her children to hold dignity in silence, to find strength in calm. That's why Jet Li, even as a global superstar, always carried an aura of inner peace that audiences could feel but never quite explain. That calmness was his mother's gift. Number 9. The woman who raised a nation's martial arts hero alone. Zhang Fenglan's greatest challenge wasn't just survival. It was raising a son destined for greatness, completely on her own. When Jet Li's father passed away, she was left to care for 5 children with almost nothing but her determination. The youngest, Li Lianjie, Jet Li's birth name, was fragile, shy, and physically small. Few could have predicted he would one day redefine action cinema across continents. But Zhang Fenglan saw something in him, a spark of focus, a quiet intensity that mirrored her own. She enrolled him in a Beijing sports school when he was 8, not because she dreamed of stardom, but because she believed it might at least give him food, discipline, and a future. It was a decision born out of desperation, yet it changed history. The school was the Beijing Wushu Academy, one of the most elite martial arts institutions in China. The moment Jet Li stepped through those gates, his life, and hers, took a turn neither could have imagined. While most mothers watched their children grow up nearby, Zhang Fenglan had to let go of her son early. Training was harsh. The boys practiced for 10 hours a day, every day, often sleeping in shared dorms and waking before dawn. But she never complained. She never tried to pull him home. She understood something deeper. To give a child greatness, a mother must sometimes endure separation. When Jet Li began winning national competitions as a teenager, newspapers hailed him as the boy who fights for China. But in the small apartment in Beijing where his mother still lived, she was simply proud and worried. Fame brought attention, but it also meant more distance. Still, she quietly supported him, never asking for money or recognition. When Jet Li later earned his first paycheck from films like Shaolin Temple, he immediately sent part of it home. His first public thanks were not to directors or trainers, but to my mother, who carried 5 children through life alone. She didn't attend premieres, she didn't smile for cameras, But her absence from the spotlight was itself a mark of her humility. Jet Li's fame could have easily transformed the family's life, yet she continued to live simply, refusing luxury. Friends said she never wanted to move into a mansion or wear jewelry. Her pride came not from material comfort, but from the quiet satisfaction of knowing her son had achieved something extraordinary, and remained kind, disciplined, and humble while doing it. And perhaps the most striking part? Zhang Fenglan never once boasted about her son's fame. She didn't need to, because for her, Jet Li wasn't a movie star. He was still the quiet boy who once fell asleep exhausted on her lap after a long day at school, dreaming of a better tomorrow. That's the paradox of Zhang Fenglan. She raised one of the most visible men in the world by mastering invisibility herself. And in doing so, she left behind one of the most powerful legacies a parent can ever give: unconditional love without expectation of reward. 8. The hidden teacher. Behind Jet Li's discipline. If you've ever watched Jet Li move, with that lightning precision, every gesture sharpened like a blade, you might assume it came from years of martial arts training alone. But the truth runs deeper. That discipline was born not just in the training halls of Beijing, but in the small apartment where Zhang Fenglan set the rhythm of her family's life. She wasn't a martial arts master. She never threw a punch, never wielded a weapon. But she had her own kind of training, a mental one. In a house ruled by scarcity, she taught her children that order was survival. Every task had meaning. Every effort, no matter how small, had purpose. Dishes were cleaned not just to avoid dirt, but to maintain harmony. Homework wasn't about grades, it was about self-respect. Jet Li later said, "My mother didn't have to tell me to practice. Watching her struggle made me practice." When he woke up before dawn to run laps in the cold, he wasn't just preparing for tournaments, he was honoring her sacrifices. Zhang Fenglan's lessons weren't written down. They were lived daily in her patience, in the way she endured hunger without complaint, in the way she carried herself with quiet dignity even when life was unbearably heavy. There's a famous saying in Chinese culture, "The mother shapes the son's heart." Zhang Fenglan didn't lecture about morals, she embodied them. When neighbors mocked her for sending her youngest son to a martial arts school instead of a real, academic path, she only smiled. "If he learns to focus," she said, "he can survive anything." That belief turned out to be prophetic. Her idea of education wasn't about what books you read or what teachers you had, it was about mastering yourself. That's why Jet Li, even when surrounded by global fame and wealth, often described his life as a discipline of the heart. He credits that mindset entirely to her. Even his spiritual journey later in life, his embrace of Buddhism, his rejection of ego, can be traced back to her influence. She taught him that true power comes from calmness, that you don't need to raise your voice to be heard, and you don't need to win every battle to live with honor. When he left for long film shoots abroad, he often called home just to hear her voice. Friends who were close to Jet Li in the 1980s recall that he would sometimes go silent after those calls, saying softly, "She still lives like nothing has changed. Maybe she's right. Maybe peace isn't about what you have, it's about what you let go." That was Zhang Fenglan's greatest lesson. Control begins not in the body, but in the soul. And for a martial artist whose life revolved around balance and movement, that teaching became the anchor that kept him from losing himself amid fame and chaos. 7. The pain she never spoke of. If Zhang Fenglan's strength defined her family, her silence defined her pain. Few people knew the emotional toll of being the mother of a national icon. Jet Li was constantly traveling, performing, and filming, often across continents. For years, she saw him only briefly between projects. Every time he left, she waved from the doorway, smiling, never letting him see the fear in her eyes. Because in China, mothers of that generation didn't talk about loneliness. They simply endured it. When Jet Li nearly died during an overseas trip in 2004 after being caught in the Indian Ocean tsunami, Zhang Fenglan didn't sleep for days. She prayed quietly, lighting incense in front of the family altar, refusing to eat until she knew her son was safe. When news finally came that he had survived, she didn't cry. She just whispered, "Thank heaven," and went back to preparing tea. But beneath that composure was a heart that had already lived through too many close calls. She had watched Jet Li break bones during training, collapse from exhaustion, and push himself to limits that terrified her. Yet she never told him to stop, because she knew that his dream, his destiny, wasn't hers to protect. It was his to pursue. There's something deeply universal about that kind of motherhood. In every culture, there are mothers who quietly sacrifice their comfort for their children's ambition. But in Zhang Fenglan's case, the contrast was extreme. She lived a humble, nearly invisible life while her son's face lit up screens from Los Angeles to Hong Kong. Reporters tried to interview her, but she always declined. She didn't want to be famous. She wanted to be left in peace. Her humility reflected an older generation of Chinese women who believed virtue lay in anonymity. She once told a family friend, "A mother's work is to let her children shine, not herself." It's a sentence that captures her entire existence. When Jet Li achieved international stardom in Hollywood films like Lethal Weapon 4 and Romeo Must Die, he wanted to bring her to America, to show her the world she had indirectly helped build. But she refused. "I belong here," she said, pointing to her modest apartment courtyard, where she tended to her small potted plants. Her choice revealed something profound. She didn't measure success by wealth or fame. To her, true victory was having all 5 of her children alive, healthy and kind. That, in her eyes, was enough. Yet even as her health began to decline, she never allowed pity. When Jet Li visited, she scolded him for worrying. "Don't waste your time on me," she'd say. "Use your time for something that lasts." Those were among her final words of advice, a reminder that even at the end of her life she was still teaching him how to live. And maybe that's what makes Zhang Fenglan unforgettable. Not the fame she avoided, not the hardship she endured, but the quiet, eternal strength of a mother who lived for others. The kind of strength that doesn't fade when the spotlight turns off. Figure 6. Her influence on Jet Li's moral compass. When Jet Li became China's national martial arts champion at only 12, newspapers celebrated him as a prodigy. But behind that smiling boy holding the trophy was a mother who refused to let success turn into arrogance. Zhang Fenglan didn't care about medals or national recognition. What mattered to her was whether her son stayed humble and grateful. Every time he came home after a competition, expecting celebration, she would quietly place a bowl of rice in front of him and say, "Eat. Tomorrow, you start again." It was her way of reminding him that victory is temporary, but character lasts forever. This philosophy shaped Jet Li's entire identity, from his early fame in Shaolin Temple to his later Hollywood years. He became known not just for his breathtaking fight choreography, but for his calm, disciplined, almost monk-like composure off-screen. Fans often described him as a man without ego, and that humility was Zhang Fenglan's doing. In interviews, Jet Li often spoke about his mother's quiet ethics. She believed real strength wasn't about power, it was about restraint, he said. When you can control yourself, no one can control you. That lesson helped him navigate the ruthless entertainment world, where fame destroys as easily as it creates. While many young stars drowned in success, Jet Li kept a spiritual distance from it. Even when he reached international fame, performing alongside big names like Mel Gibson or Aaliyah, his core never shifted. Zhang Fenglan had built an unshakable foundation of morality that no amount of fame could erode. She taught him to view wealth as a tool, not a goal. That's why Jet Li later dedicated much of his fortune to humanitarian causes, founding the One Foundation for Disaster Relief and Child Welfare. Friends who visited Zhang Fenglan, HUS, home noticed something striking. No pictures of her son's Hollywood premieres, no posters, no displays of wealth. Just a single small photograph of young Jet Li in his martial arts uniform, smiling shyly beside her. It wasn't pride in his fame, it was pride in his discipline. Zhang Fenglan also taught him something Western audiences rarely understood about Jet Li, the idea of Wu Dai, or martial virtue. In traditional Chinese culture, martial arts are not just about fighting, but about moral refinement. She instilled that balance early. If you fight without virtue, you lose even when you win. This saying became Jet Li's moral compass, guiding him to approach fame not as a conquest, but as a test of humility. Her values shaped not just her son's public persona, but his private life as well. When he faced scandals or media attacks, Jet Li never lashed out or sought revenge. Instead, he quoted his mother, "When someone throws dirt at you, let it fall to the ground. Don't pick it up and throw it back. It only makes your hands dirty." Those words, born from a woman who survived poverty and pain, became his code of honor. In a world obsessed with image, Zhang Fenglan raised a man who valued silence, respect, and inner balance over fame. And perhaps the greatest proof of her wisdom is this. Decades after her passing, Jet Li still lives by her words more than by any Hollywood script. Number 5. The unseen toll of a son's stardom. When Jet Li's fame exploded across Asia in the 1980s, Zhang Fenglan found herself living two lives. Publicly, she was the mother of a national icon, respected, even revered. Privately, she was a woman constantly worried about her son's safety. Fame had brought him into the orbit of dangerous stunts, political pressure, and media scrutiny. For every cheering crowd, there was an accident, an injury, or a late-night phone call that left her heart racing. She was proud, yes, but that pride carried anxiety. During the filming of Once Upon a Time in China, Jet Li suffered multiple back and knee injuries. She'd say, "He's fighting ghosts now. He doesn't know when to stop." Her fear wasn't just for his body, it was for his spirit. She had seen too many stories of fame consuming good people. The lavish parties, the endless travel, the fake friends. She worried those things might erode the simple values she had built into him. So, she prayed daily, not for his success, but for his peace. When Jet Li started spending more time abroad, especially in the United States, her loneliness deepened. Letters arrived less often, phone calls became shorter. She understood. It was the cost of his dreams. But mothers like Zhang Fenglan don't stop worrying just because their children grow up. She kept his childhood shoes in a small wooden box, saying, "So he remembers where he came from." Friends recall that she was fiercely protective of her son's privacy. When reporters came asking for interviews, she refused, saying, "He already gives enough of himself to the world." Her refusal only added to the mystery surrounding her. Many fans didn't even know Jet Li's mother was still alive during his peak years. And yet, for all the emotional strain, she never once told him to quit. She believed that every person has a purpose, and hers was to give him the strength to fulfill his. That quiet acceptance became a kind of emotional armor for Jet Li. Whenever he faced setbacks, financial crises, injuries, or personal losses, he drew on her example. Endurance without bitterness. Later, when Jet Li became one of the few Asian actors to conquer Hollywood, starring in films like Kiss of the Dragon and Fearless, he said something deeply revealing. "My mother never chased dreams for herself, but she gave me permission to chase mine, even when it broke her heart." It's a sentence that perfectly captures their bond. A love defined not by constant closeness, but by profound understanding. She gave him freedom, knowing it might mean distance. She gave him strength, knowing it might mean loneliness. In a world where fame often destroys families, Zhang Fenglan quietly kept hers intact by never letting pride outweigh love. Her sacrifices remained invisible to the world, but Jet Li never forgot them. Even after achieving global success, he often described his mother's love as the only real success he ever had. And perhaps that is what makes this story so deeply human. The world saw Jet Li as a hero, but in his heart, the true hero was always Zhang Fenglan. 4. The philosophy of love and detachment. Zhang Fenglan never lived her life seeking admiration or comfort. Her philosophy was built on simplicity and emotional balance, a concept that later became the spiritual backbone of Jet Li's worldview. While many parents dream of keeping their children close, she believed in loving without holding on. In a culture that prized obedience, she offered freedom, a radical act of trust. She often told her children, "If you love something, let it grow where it belongs, not where you can see it." Those words became the emotional compass for Jet Li, who spent most of his adult life far from home, filming in different countries, speaking languages his mother never learned, and living among people she would never meet. But no matter how far he went, her lessons followed him like a silent prayer. When Jet Li began studying Buddhism later in life, reporters assumed it was something new he had discovered. Yet those close to him say it was simply his mother's wisdom taking a new form. She had always taught him the essence of detachment, not as a lack of feeling, but as an act of understanding. To hold on too tightly, she once said, is to make what you love suffer. This teaching shaped Jet Li's responses to tragedy. In 2004, when he nearly drowned during the tsunami in the Maldives, he said the experience reminded him of his mother's words. "Life and death are just tides. We can only flow with them." That calm acceptance, the ability to face mortality without panic, was her gift to him. Even when he lost close friends or faced betrayal in the film industry, Jet Li never spoke with resentment. He often quoted his mother's quiet lessons. "No one owes you peace. You must build it yourself." That phrase could have easily come from a philosopher, yet it came from a woman who spent her entire life managing scarcity, grief, and uncertainty. Zhang Fenglan's version of love wasn't the loud, dramatic kind. It was silent, resilient, and profoundly selfless. She didn't express affection through hugs or praise, but through protection and sacrifice. When Jet Li once said in an interview that he rarely saw his mother cry, he added, "But every time she was silent for too long, I knew something was breaking inside her." That silence became his model for emotional strength. When Jet Li suffered health issues later in life, and rumors spread about his frail condition, he responded not with fear, but with reflection. "My mother used to say we borrow our bodies, not own them," he explained. "When the body gets tired, return it gracefully." It was her worldview, re-emerging through his voice decades later. Even his global humanitarian work, the One Foundation, his advocacy for disaster relief, and his message of universal compassion can be traced back to her early example. Zhang Fenglan didn't talk about saving the world. She just did what she could for those around her. To Jet Li, that was enlightenment in its purest form. In the end, Zhang Fenglan's philosophy of love and detachment shaped not only her son N's character, but also his life mission, to bring calm, balance, and kindness to a chaotic world. Through him, her quiet voice continues to echo far beyond Beijing, whispering the same timeless truth: real love does not cling, it guides. 3. The legacy she never claimed. By the time Zhang Fenglan reached her final years, Jet Li had already become a global phenomenon, an actor, philanthropist, and spiritual figure admired by millions. Yet, in her modest Beijing apartment, nothing much had changed. She still rose early, swept her small courtyard, and boiled tea in a chipped kettle. To outsiders, she seemed untouched by her son's fame, but for Jet Li, that was exactly what made her remarkable. She refused luxury even when offered. Jet Li once tried to buy her a large modern home with a garden, but she declined gently. "I already have a roof and sky," she said. "Why would I need more?" It wasn't stubbornness. It was principle. She believed that happiness didn't come from expansion but from contentment. To her, the ability to live simply in a complex world was the greatest form of freedom. That attitude profoundly influenced Jet Li's later retreat from the spotlight. As he aged, he became less interested in movie deals and more focused on spiritual development. He turned down major roles and began living with monk-like simplicity, an echo of his mother's quiet wisdom. When asked why he seemed to step away from Hollywood, he said, "Because my mother taught me that life's biggest movie is the one inside your own heart." But Zhang Fenglan's legacy wasn't just about philosophy. It was about generational transformation. She represented an era of Chinese mothers who lived through famine, political upheaval, and rebuilding. Women who never sought recognition but carried their families on their backs. Through her, Jet Li inherited not just personal discipline, but the emotional DNA of resilience that defines a nation. Even after her passing, her lessons continued shaping his life. In one of his most emotional public interviews, Jet Li confessed that every achievement he ever had felt incomplete without her. "When she left, I realized I had been chasing the world to fill the space she left behind. Her departure was quiet, just like her life. There were no headlines, no ceremonies, only her family gathering in silence, remembering her laugh, her hands, her endless patience. But in that silence, something extraordinary happened. Jet Li's fans began learning about her for the first time. Articles surfaced, and people around the world discovered the woman behind the legend. They saw how one mother's sacrifice shaped not only a man, but an entire cultural icon. What Zhang Fenglan never claimed as her legacy became undeniable, a legacy of endurance, compassion, and moral clarity. She didn't need statues or biographies. Her influence lived in the stillness of Jet Li's movements, in the kindness of his words, and in the peace he brings wherever he goes. And in a poetic twist, her anonymity became her immortality. While fame fades, her quiet strength continues to ripple across generations. Through her son's films, his philosophy, and the millions of lives his compassion has touched. She may have left the world without fanfare, but her spirit remains woven into the very essence of Jet Li's story. A story not just of martial arts or fame, but of love that endures even in silence. Part 5. The Eternal Bond Between Mother and Son. 2. The Hidden Chapter. When Jet Li almost lost her fame may have brought Jet Li honor, wealth, and travel, but it couldn't protect him from the one fear that haunted him most: losing his mother. In the mid-1990s, when Jet Li was at the height of his fame, Zhang Fenglan's health began to decline. Years of hardship had left her frail, and the strain of old age began to show. But in her usual fashion, she hid her pain. She didn't want her son to worry, and so she pretended everything was fine whenever he called from abroad. It wasn't until Jet Li returned home one winter that he saw the truth. The strong woman who had once carried the family through famine now struggled to climb the stairs. That moment shattered him. All his trophies, his movie deals, his fame, they felt meaningless against the fragility of time. He later admitted, "That was when I realized the only thing you can't win in life is time. You can only honor it." From that day, Jet Li began rearranging his life around her. He stopped taking as many overseas projects, stayed longer in Beijing, and spent hours simply sitting by her side, listening to her stories. It wasn't about guilt, it was about gratitude. He understood that his success was built entirely upon her sacrifices, and he didn't want her final years to be lonely. Those who knew Jet Li during that time said his mother's presence changed him. He became more reflective, more spiritual. He spent less energy chasing new roles and more on finding inner peace. It was also during these years that he started studying Buddhism seriously, learning about compassion, impermanence, and the illusion of attachment, concepts his mother had already lived by without ever reading a scripture. When Zhang Fenglan passed away quietly, Jet Li didn't announce it publicly. There were no tabloids, no interviews. He kept her memory private, saying only, "My mother didn't like noise. I'll honor her in silence." That restraint, once again, reflected everything she had taught him: dignity through composure, grief without spectacle. He later shared that in her final moments she told him something that would stay with him forever. "You don't owe me anything. Just live kindly." That simple phrase became the guiding principle for his later life. Every act of charity, every peaceful message, every humble gesture he's shown since then stems from those words. Even now, decades after her passing, Jet Li often speaks of her as his spiritual teacher. In one interview, when asked about his greatest role model, he smiled and said, "Not Bruce Lee, not Buddha, my mother." The audience laughed softly, but his eyes didn't. "She taught me how to fight without violence, how to win without pride, and how to love without holding on." In that single sentence lies the truth about Zhang Fenglan's influence. She didn't just raise a fighter, she raised a philosopher. And in every movement Jet Li makes, every graceful kick, every calm smile, her presence still lingers, like a breath of patience that time cannot erase. Circle 1. The legacy that outlived fame. When history remembers Jet Li, it will speak of his skill, his discipline, his spiritual depth. But to understand the man behind the legend, one must look beyond the martial arts tournaments and the movie sets, to the humble kitchen in Beijing where a widowed mother stirred rice for 5 children dreaming of nothing more than their safety. Zhang Fenglan's legacy is not written in books or carved in stone. It lives in the way Jet Li treats people, with respect, humility, and calmness. It lives in the way he speaks about money and power, not as prizes, but as illusions. It lives in his foundation's work for children and disaster victims, echoing her lifelong lesson that compassion begins with those who have less. She never traveled the world, but her wisdom did. Through Jet Li, her words reached millions. She taught a generation, without ever knowing it, that true success is not about how high you rise, but how grounded you remain. Her life proved that greatness doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through generations, reshaping the world one heart at a time. Jet Li has often said that his fame, his acting, even his martial arts, all of it, was merely a shadow of her light. When asked what he would say if he could speak to her again, his reply was simple. "I'd say thank you, but she'd tell me to stop talking and go help someone instead." That exchange captures them both perfectly. The son who speaks with gratitude, and the mother who believed action spoke louder than any words. In a time when the world celebrates loud success, Zhang Fenglan remains a reminder of quiet strength. She never sought credit, yet her influence rippled across continents. She never had wealth, yet she gave her son everything money could never buy: integrity, discipline, peace. And so, her story stands as one of the great unsung tales of modern history. A testament to how one woman's endurance shaped not just a man, but a moral legacy that transcends fame, language, and culture. Through Jet Li, Zhang Fenglan continues to live on, not as a celebrity's mother, but as a silent architect of wisdom who built a hero with nothing but love and perseverance. Zhang Fenglan's life may have unfolded in the shadows, but her influence burns brightly through her son's legacy. She reminds us that the most powerful forces in the world are often unseen: the patience that endures, the love that gives, the strength that never needs to be spoken. If you enjoyed uncovering the untold story behind Jet Li's greatest inspiration, don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who believes true greatness begins at home. Subscribe to our channel for more fascinating stories behind history's legends, and join our community to access exclusive deep dive videos and behind-the-scenes content. And if you'd like to support us directly, click the thanks button below. Every contribution helps us bring you more powerful, forgotten stories just like this one. Because sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones the world never saw.